welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about rhythm and pattern. And if you hear little chompy sounds in the background, that's my cat eating. It's a little gross, but I'm sorry. I got to record these when I can, so that's what's going on there. Today's lesson is going to work a little bit like the past one, where you guys are going to be doing a lot of looking at images, but I am going to be talking throughout the images to kind of point things out for you. So let's talk about rhythm. How does rhythm work? We'll be looking at rhythm through the lens of a few different artists before we move on to pattern. And the first one up is Jacob Lawrence. If we take a look at this image of a barber shop, we can see three major repeated images placed next to each other across the picture plane from left to right. There are slight modulations from shape to shape, from shape of barber and person getting their hair done to the next and the next. This kind of repetition of imagery, repetition of shape placed next to each other across the picture plane helps to create a kind of rhythm. Very often in works of art, this kind of rhythm will play out in a way that changes subtly across space and time. Here in this image of three school children, we get a very similar sort of rhythm. So you'll see that rhythm can be created through repetition of similar but slightly different shapes. The spatial location in relation to the picture plane of these elements is important as well. Jacob Lawrence has a rather flat space that he's working in. All of the imagery exists on the surface of the picture plane. This helps to establish a rhythm. If these elements were closer and further away from you, the viewer, the rhythm might not be as clearly established. Here's a kind of rhythm that moves from fast to slow, where on the left, the figures are clumped close together, and as we move to the right, they move slowly further apart until we're left with just the singular figure, isolated. Another instance of a repetition of three similar shapes to create rhythm across the picture plane. Here you'll also see pattern in the background on the floor and on the wall as well in the red diamond shapes. This helps to also create a sense of rhythm, a secondary rhythm to the primary rhythm. Here, Lawrence is using groups of similar shapes, grouped through proximity to create a kind of rhythm. So rhythm has to do with similarity of shape. It has to do with the way that these shapes are placed next to each other. And even though we can read the bottom left group of figures as being closer to us than the top left group, Lawrence is still keeping everything relatively compressed close to the picture plane. That similarity in space between the viewer and the subject matter helps to reinforce the idea of this rhythm. Again, from Lawrence, a series of repeated shapes. Similar, never quite the same, a sort of modulation from left to right. The fire from the weapons here creates interesting interludes into the rhythm, breaking it up. Let's look at Graham Nickson. Nickson's work is figurative as well, and you can see that he's pulling some of the same tricks that Lawrence is, although in a different style. Repeated human shapes, moving from left to right in various patterns in terms of their positionality, from vertical to horizontal, and the kinds of shapes that these figures are making. In the Arnheim book, Art and Visual Perception, you should have read the chapter on form. And in that, he opens with the line, "Form is the visible shape of content." He also says that shape is a concept in two different ways. First, because we see every shape as a kind of shape. And second, because each kind of shape is seen as the form of the whole kinds of objects. So each shape here that represents the human form is slightly different, but in each instance, we recognize it as human. It is a kind of shape. You could replace these in your designs with simple rectangular shapes. The red shirt that the bather is holding above her head in the center of the composition becomes a triangle, and the green shirt that the rightmost bather is holding above his head becomes another sort of rectangle. Here again, the same sort of idea, and we've talked about this before, where artists are going to work in themes. They're going to be playing with the same idea over and over again because this sort of thing becomes an obsession for them. But here these bathers as kinds of shapes, repeated, and the distance from each other helps to create the rhythm. Here, rhythm still exists, but it's a little bit more complicated. As I said, when artists start to pile things on in terms of space, where figures and objects are in front of each other, and further from us as the viewer from the picture plane, or closer to us, rhythm starts to become more complicated in terms of being able to read it as such. But here Nickson is still relying on this repetition of similar shapes so often that it still reads as a kind of rhythm. The grouping of figures helps this as well. We might have a rhythm that starts out fast on the left and moves to very slow read on the right. Isolation and grouping through proximity will help create this. You can think of the figures in these paintings as being similar to the drum machine that we saw being used in the Nine Inch Nails video earlier. We might read the rhythm of this painting as being dun, 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 from the figure in the top left to the three figures in the bottom quadrant. Here, Nickson is using the shapes of the tents as well to help create his rhythm across the picture plane. The openings of the tents are very similar to the sizes of the figures shown. This helps to unify them with the figures and read them as part of the rhythm. Let's move on to Henri Matisse. Here, Matisse is using the human form in a very similar way that Nickson was to help create rhythm from left to right. The figures exist at fairly regular intervals from each other, but the slight variation in their shapes and their orientation, facing us or facing away, standing or seated, helps to create the variety of the rhythm. This painting almost reads like a sheet of music, notes on a musical staff, which is appropriate. The name of the painting is music. Here we can talk about a sort of modulation of shape The four seated figures are all very similar to each other with small differences, and then there's a contrast of the sudden standing figure playing the violin. It's another painting from the same series by Matisse. This one is called Dance, where again, all of these shapes, though quite different from one another, still read as a human shape, as a type of shape. It creates a rhythm that moves around and back on the painting. Here we have Matisse creating work that is quite flat. These are later works. Towards the end of his life, it became harder and harder for him to paint with a brush, and he started painting up full sheets of paper and cutting them out. This lent these flat works of art a kind of sculptural quality because of the physicality of cutting the shapes out. He's reported as saying that for the first time he felt like he was actually drawing. But here, similar sorts of shapes can help create a rhythm. And the one on the right, even though there's a variety of size here, or rather a contrast of size with one large and five smaller shapes, there's still a rhythm that is being created through the interval of space in between. The same can be said for the work on the left here. If we look at the work on the right, this is starting to move into a different sort of category. It's becoming a little bit more decorative, though there's still enough contrast happening and surprise that it doesn't just become simply decoration. Here Matisse is moving into a more sort of pattern creation, and this is what we're going to be looking at here, more towards pattern. And so we have works that are just simply pattern. And here's the difference between rhythm and pattern, where rhythm is relying on similar shapes or shapes that modulate with spacing that can be regular intervals or modulated intervals of objects being closer and then further apart to create a different sort of rhythm across the image. Pattern is going to have quite similar shapes, indeed the same sort of shapes, repeated over and over at always regular intervals. While rhythm works best when the image stays close to the picture plane, it doesn't dive deep into 3D illusionistic space, pattern is always going to be flat. It will always read as being on the picture plane. Here's another one of those by Matisse. And so we've looked at rhythm. Matisse grew up in a fabric store that his family owned, so he was surrounded from a very young age in patterns. This is part of the reason that it shows up so often in his work. But he also uses patterns in different ways. Like we just saw, he can create decorative pattern, or he can use it in this painting to flatten space. Here we have the human figure, and it is abstracted, but it does exist in its own created space, and we can read that space of the figure. But the pattern that surrounds the figure flattens and compresses that space back to the picture plane. This creates a kind of tension that we haven't discussed before. It's a spatial tension. The image wants to go back, but the pattern prevents it from moving back into space. This is a kind of contrast. It's a contrast of spatial depth. A lot of artists use pattern in this way to interrupt space. The picture plane, the format itself, is where the power of the image comes from. Even in the most deeply illusionistic works by Renaissance painters, they're still respecting the picture plane and the fact that the work of art is indeed two-dimensional. It doesn't actually move back into space at all. Here, in the middle of the 20th century, artists started to overemphasize the picture plane. But this is nothing new. This is actually a return to the kinds of space that you might see, for instance, in Egyptian drawing or Japanese woodblock prints. Keeping the image on the picture plane, flattened in space, helps to lend the image a directness and immediacy to the visual experience. That's not to say that illusionism and deep recessive space doesn't have its place in the two-dimensional arts, painting and drawing and graphic design. It's just a tool that you can use, a different sort of tension that you can give the image. And again, even if you look at something like Leonardo da Vinci's work, where there is deep recessive, illusionistic space, he's always going to make sure that the picture plane itself is respected so that all of the imagery exists both simultaneously in deep space and directly on the picture plane. It's a contradiction in terms, but it's what creates the most visually striking work. Here, another example of Matisse using pattern to flatten space and create tension. Again, pattern flattening space around the figure, keeping everything on the picture plane. So let's talk about pattern. You might be familiar with this sort of pattern. You might call it plaid. It is not. It is tartan, which is a form of pattern that comes from Scotland. And families have their own distinct tartan patterns that repeat over and over again that are very specific in terms of the proportions at which the lines intersect with each other, how wide the lines are, what colors are being used, and so on and so forth. Again, pattern, you see, absolutely flattens space. Here's a different kind of pattern from a different culture. This is a kente cloth, which comes from Ghana. Kente cloth is an indigenous Ghanaian textile, and the more intricate the patterns, the more colors used in the patterns, was used to represent wealth and standing within the community. Pattern, you can see, usually involves something that seems like it could go on forever, an endlessly repeating pattern of shapes. We'll look at an artist now, Anatsui, who is from Ghana and who uses this idea of the kente cloth in a very different way. Here's one of his works. All of his works recall the idea of the kente cloth, a very colorful and patterned fabric. But this is made out of actually recycled garbage. It's beer bottle caps and plastic wrappings that go around liquor bottles and different sorts of trash. But he's also doing something else with it. Now, this is sculptural work, and we're not dealing with sculpture, we're not dealing with 3D design. But there's a tension here, and it's very similar actually to the tension in the Matisse paintings, where there is space present, but the pattern of the overall design flattens it. There's a tension between space and the flat picture plane. Here, the kind of waves of the work of art might be reminiscent of what the kente cloth looks like draped over someone, worn on the body. Here's another. These things are, as you can see, huge. They're absolutely massive works. And although we're not working in 3 dimensions, and this is a 3-dimensional work, it reads mostly in the 2-dimensional field. The space of it is relatively shallow. It's not sculpture in the round. And you can easily create patterns that warp and change on a 2-dimensional surface depending on the way that you use shapes next to each other. Here's another where the pattern here clearly defined through the horizontal stripes that move across the work is seen as being interrupted through the 3-dimensionality. And another work. Another thing that's happening with these works of art is that they don't exist in the solid, stated 4 lines of a picture format. But in this instance, the format of the wall itself is what helps to define the work of art. So Anatsui is using various different sorts of patterns next to each other. Again, pattern that has this really flattening effect and contrasting it against the warping of the material itself. There's another artist who's going to do that in a little different way, named Gustav Klimt. You've probably seen this image before. It's called The Kiss. I don't know how many times I've seen this image reproduced on all sorts of things, from umbrellas to coffee mugs, posters. One of you probably has this hanging up in their dorm or their room. But Klimt is going to use pattern and then the absence of pattern in really interesting ways. The figures here are clothed in highly patterned garments. The flowers of the hill that they're standing on becomes a kind of pattern, and even the speckling and the gold in the background of the image creates its own sort of pattern. And all of this has this hyper flattening effect. It's a very decorative sort of artwork. That is then contrasted against the swelling nature of the organic forms, the faces sticking out, and the hands and the elbow and the feet. It's also quite symbolic. You'll see that the man is clothed in a garment that has patterns that are very rectilinear, where the woman has a garment on that has a lot of rounder shapes. Here's another one. I don't know, Klimt, I think, is a pretty famous artist. You might have seen a few of these, but this is the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. And you can see that the chair that she's sitting on actually camouflages in with the gold background. You can just make out the arms of the chair, especially if you look to the left of the figure. If you look to the left of where her hands are, and then down a little bit, you can just make out the arm of the chair. The arm bleeds into the background, bleeds into the dress that she's wearing, and the only real contrast then comes from the small bit of green and the checker pattern on the bottom left-hand corner, and then the swelling form again, the human forms that peek out from the garments of her hands and her face. But even here in the more organic shapes, he's placed a lot of emphasis on the shape of the eyes, the shape of her lips, which is repeated in the garment that she's wearing, this sort of Egyptian eye motif that's repeated over and over again. Here's another one where the pattern can become more organic, and so that it can unify with the organic human forms present in the painting while still have the flattening effect of pattern. So there's a spatial contrast that's happening where the pattern always wants to bounce back to the picture plane, and the more organic swelling forms want to push beyond into space. And again, here is another one where the figure standing is wearing garments that blend in with the pattern on the wall. And again, where the larger patterns on the background are repeated, and the smaller patterns on the figure's dress, which are all contained within triangles, so repeated triangles over and over again with those swirly curly cues that are meant to represent a tree within the triangles and without the figure on the background. And here are two images from earlier in his career and later in his career. The same subject matter, Judith and the head of Holofernes. Holofernes was a general who was going to come and destroy the town, leading an army to destroy the town where Judith lived, and she seduced him, got him nice and drunk, got him into bed, and chopped his head off. And that's his head that you can see in the bottom right corner of each painting. But again, the heavy use of pattern, which flattens the picture plane, contrasting against the more swelling organic shapes. So that's it. That's rhythm and pattern, and some of the different ways that they can be used. They can be used to create modulation across the picture plane, to flatten the picture plane, to push depth into the picture plane. And so here's your homework. Studio problem number 7, using narrow dark lines in a square format. And I feel like I need to emphasize this again. When I say square format, it means square. That's a ratio of 1 unit to 1 unit. So whatever size your square is, if it's 5 inches by 5 inches, then it needs to be that. It can't be 5 by 4.5. That's not a square. And it can't be 3 by 6. That's not a square. So when I say square format, use a square format. And when I say narrow dark lines, that means that we're using exclusively narrow dark lines. Don't add tone to your designs. We're not doing that yet. There's a time and place for this stuff, and each one of these studio problems builds on the previous one. I didn't create this system. This is how I was taught design, and it's effective, but you have to follow the program here a little bit. So use narrow dark lines exclusively in a square format. Create rhythm through position. So when we're thinking about those Jacob Lawrence paintings or those Graham Nickson paintings, this position of the figures, usually all coinciding at a regular interval of space from the viewer. So none of them are too far back from the viewer. They all exist on the same level of depth from the viewer. That's a kind of position. And then the positionality in terms of grouping. Do some of them positioned close to each other and some far apart? Is there a regular interval in between the objects on your picture plane to help create that sort of rhythm? Or there's a modulated rhythm, where some are closer together, moving to further apart as you move across the picture plane. So create rhythm through position and use a variety of shapes. In a lot of these paintings, they were using human-like shapes. We recognize the shapes that they were using to be the figural. You can't use representational imagery in your work, but you can use different sorts of shapes, and those shapes can modulate from one to the other, or they can be quite varied. So create a variety of shape and create rhythm through the way that the shapes are positioned next to each other. Give me 10 thumbnails and 10 variations along with your final mounted work. And that's it. If you have any questions, email me.